The grass is always greener on the other side, right? This is a cautionary tale that's as old as time. Be content with what you have, or as J. Cole put it, love yours. Now, as a diehard football fan, and as a fan of a team that happens to have never won a Super Bowl before, I've been thinking about this a lot recently. Is this really the best way to operate? In life? Sure, yeah, I think this is pretty good advice, but if you want to win a Super Bowl, I'm not so sure. Every season, there's always a handful of coaches that get fired, but this year in particular was interesting for a couple of reasons. For starters, a whopping 10 teams let go of their head coach, the most in a single cycle since the NFL-AFL merger in 1970. But what I think is even more interesting is who was fired. Mike Tomlin, John Harbaugh, Sean McDermott. These guys weren't just coaching bottom feeders, they were consistent winners. Shoot, Tomlin and McDermott both made the playoffs that year, and McDermott's team even won a game in the playoffs. These were very polarizing decisions. Are the Steelers, Ravens, and Bills overthinking this, getting greedy, and setting themselves up for disaster? Or is the grass truly greener on the other side? Well, if you ask me, I think they all made the right call. And if anything, more teams should be doing this. Hey guys, it's me, Dr. Pigskin. The doctor is in, and I've got a take that I've been stewing on for quite a few months now that I'm ready to get off my chest. When in doubt, fire the head coach. Now, what I mean by this is I think it's better to err on the side of having less patience than more patience with your head coach, right? If your goal really is to win a Super Bowl, you can't just sit around on your hands waiting around for years for something to happen. If it's clear that it's not going to work out, you got to make the tough decision and pull the plug as soon as possible. And I get this might fly in the face of conventional wisdom a little bit. Oftentimes you'll see teams being praised if they're patient with their head coaches. That's the wise, level-headed, smart thing to do, but I'm going to argue otherwise, and I think that NFL history, especially recent history, is on my side. So, if you're ready, in the words of the legendary Grant Cohn, to fire the head coach too, well, I've got the video for you. All right, with that in mind, let's get started. Dan Campbell is a man of many iconic sound bites, but there's one quote in particular that really stands out to me. I think this is one of the realest things any NFL coach has ever said. After a heartbreaking, devastating loss in the NFC Championship game against the 49ers, Campbell addressed his squad, who just missed out on making the first Super Bowl in franchise history. The normally optimistic Campbell, who usually profiles as a buff Ted Lasso type, instead looked his team dead in the eyes and said, "This may have been our only shot." You've probably seen this quote graphic before. It's gone triple platinum on NFL Twitter, and there's a reason for that. This being the only shot that the Dan Campbell Lions would ever get to make a Super Bowl was a crazy thing to think at the time. If anything, this was a young, up-and-coming team who was ahead of schedule. This felt like only the beginning of the Dan Campbell era. But here's the crazier thing. In the 2 years since, this quote, unfortunately for the Lions, has aged kind of well. The Lions haven't been back to the NFC Championship game since. They even missed out on the playoffs altogether last season. Only half of the starters from that 2023 team are still with Detroit. Both coordinators have gone on to be head coaches. This is a completely different team. Dan Campbell just might have been right. That might have really been their only shot. Super Bowl windows close a heck of a lot quicker than you think, but here's the important question now. What do you do with that information? Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that Dan Campbell should be fired right this second, or it's organizational malpractice that he's still the coach there. He's going to get another crack at it, sure. But let me say this. If Detroit were to miss the playoffs again this next season, or even make the playoffs but get bounced in the first round, would it really be the craziest thing in the world for the Lions to just accept that that was their only shot, rip the Band-Aid off, and start over? I really don't think so. And this is not to just single out Dan Campbell either, right? There's a lot of different teams and coaches that this can apply to. In order to really get on board with this way of thinking, this idea that you should have less patience with your head coach, you have to understand just how small of a window you're working with here to build a Super Bowl team. Get this, in the entire history of the NFL, there have been only 2 instances of a head coach spending at least 10 years with the team, not winning a Super Bowl in those 10 years, before finally getting over the hump and winning it all. Just 2. Tom Landry with the Cowboys and Bill Cowher with the Steelers. Furthermore, of the 24 Super Bowl champions since 2002, only 8 of them have been led by a head coach who is not within their first 5 years with the team. That means about 2/3 of the Super Bowl champions in the modern NFL were led by a relatively new head coach. And we can pare that number down even further. Of those 8 teams that were exceptions, 3 of them were led by Bill Belichick, who had already won multiple Super Bowls within his first 5 years with the Patriots, and one of them was led by Tom Coughlin, who already won a Super Bowl within his first 5 years with the Giants. Another way to put this, of the 39 coaches since 2002 that did not win a Super Bowl within their first 5 years with their team, only 2 of them ended up finally getting over the hump and winning it all later down the line. Andy Reid with the Chiefs and the aforementioned Bill Cowher with the Steelers. That's kind of wild, no? There is insurmountable evidence showing us that the window for a head coach to win a Super Bowl is exceptionally small. If it doesn't happen in the first 5 years, it's probably not going to happen at all. You've probably heard some iteration of these stats before. I know I certainly have, but what can we take away from this? Why is this the case? You know, the Athletic Football Show had a segment about this topic as well back in April, and Robert Mays made a really good point. He said that in that span of time, 5 years, or in the case of their discussion, 6 years, is more or less the life cycle of a team. In that time span, you'll see a coach come in, usually inheriting a poor roster, spend the first few years building up the team in their image. Those few years in the middle are the prime of the team, and by year 5 or year 6, the roster and coaching staff will start to turn over a lot. And I gotta say, that lines up pretty nicely with the Dan Campbell example. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's going into year 6 with the Lions, and it feels like a turning point in his tenure. So with all that in mind, I think this starts to make a lot more sense, right? Windows just close a lot quicker than you think in the NFL. The idea of building up a team with a young core of players and keeping them together for 10 years is outdated. It doesn't really happen. So why should we have that expectation with coaches either? That's the biggest takeaway that I've gotten from all this. History shows that constantly trying to run it back, whether it be from a roster standpoint or a coaching standpoint, isn't going to get you over the hump. And yeah, I get it. This bucks conventional wisdom. Putting Dan Campbell on the hot seat just 2 years after an NFC Championship game appearance and 1 year after finishing as runner-up for Coach of the Year seems a bit rash, but should it? I would argue no. And I'd say the same thing about a few other high-profile coaches who have been around for at least 5 years with their team. A few months ago, I got into a pretty fun debate with my live stream chat over whether or not Kevin O'Connell and Matt LaFleur should be on the hot seat. I argue they should, and I say that while recognizing that they're 2 very gifted coaches and would probably be immediately snapped up by another team should they be fired. I get that, but I also think it's kind of fair to say that time is running out on them. At what point do you accept that, as great as they may be, they might have missed their only shot? If either of those 2 teams miss out on the playoffs next season, I think it makes more sense to admit defeat and start over. I think the sooner that you accept that and realize it's time to start over, the better. And you know what? Yeah, maybe this is a slightly pessimistic way of looking at things, but maybe that's okay. Hey, maybe it isn't rash, immature, unreasonable to move on from your head coach as soon as you've realized their only shot has come and gone. Maybe conventional wisdom is wrong. Maybe patience is a slippery slope. And I tell you what, I don't think this is just theory or speculation either. There's an actual concrete example of this working, because one of the smartest, most forward-thinking organizations in the NFL is also one of the least patient. To stick with our theme of kicking off chapters with quotes from some of the wisest figures in their field, here's a quote from the great Albert Einstein. Insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Now, forget quote graphics on Twitter. This one went triple platinum in middle school science classrooms, but I gotta say, I really like this quote. I think it perfectly captures what I'm trying to get at here. Having patience with the coaching staff is usually the mark of a good organization, and sure, okay, you don't want to be that team that's firing a coach every year, right? That's insanity. But I'd also say, with those numbers in mind from Chapter 1, I have to ask, when does patience become insanity? Let's compare 2 franchises, the Philadelphia Eagles and the Cincinnati Bengals. This might seem like a random pair of teams, but hear me out. Both of these teams have had a lot of patience with one of their head coaches within a pretty close window of time. The Eagles held on to Andy Reid for 14 seasons from 1999 to 2012, and the Bengals held on to Marvin Lewis for 16 years from 2003 to 2018. These 2 coaches, while successful, both failed to get over the hump and win a Super Bowl, and eventually, after well over a decade, were finally fired. But here's what's interesting. These 2 teams have taken vastly different approaches since moving on from their longtime head coach. The Bengals have done the, quote, right thing to do. They've kept the same patience with Lewis's successor, Zach Taylor. He's been the only Bengals coach since, and believe it or not, he's entering year 8 with the team. The Eagles, meanwhile, have been anything but patient. They've cycled through 3 different head coaches in the 13 years since Reid's firing, with no coach being there longer than 5 years. Guess which team has been more successful? I'll tell you this, it's not the one with only 2 coaches since 2003. It's the one that fired Chip Kelly in the middle of his 3rd year, despite having back-to-back 10-win seasons in his first 2 years. It's the one that fired Doug Peterson just 3 years after giving Philly their first ever Super Bowl, with 2 of the 3 following years resulting in trips to the playoffs. It's the team that learned their lesson from hanging on to a coach for too long and has consistently made the right call on when to let their guy go since. Do you think the Eagles would have won the Super Bowl in 2017 had they had a little more patience with Chip Kelly? I don't think so. Do you think the Eagles would have won another Super Bowl in 2024 had they had a little more patience with Doug Peterson? I don't think so. And despite a stellar record and consistent trips to the playoffs, would you really blame them for running out of patience with Nick Sirianni should they not go on a deep playoff run this season? I wouldn't. They've been vindicated time and time again for moving on from their coach as soon as their only shot came and went. And this doesn't just apply to the Eagles. There's more examples of this approach working too. John Fox made the playoffs every single season with the Broncos. He was coming off a 12-4 year and still got fired. No patience whatsoever with him. But the next year, under Gary Kubiak, Denver went on to win the Super Bowl. Tony Dungy was a consistent winner with Tampa, but just couldn't quite win the big one. Even coming off a season where the Bucs made the playoffs in 2001, Dungy was still fired and replaced by John Gruden. And the next year, the Bucs went on to win the Super Bowl. Pete Carroll's Seahawks looked like they were due for a renaissance with back-to-back winning seasons in 2022 and 2023 and a playoff appearance. But even with that, Seattle knew it was time to move on, brought in Mike Macdonald, and 2 years later, won a Super Bowl that I really don't think they would have won had they been patient with Pete Carroll. And the perils of being overly patient aren't exclusive to the Bengals either. My team, the Vikings, were perhaps a little too patient with Mike Zimmer, as much as I love the guy. I don't think it's a coincidence that his best shot to win it all was 2017, his 4th year as a coach, and the following 4 years felt like a desperate attempt to recreate a team that was no more. I really think that holding on to Zimmer, even after a tough 2020 season, really hurt the franchise. There were some awful contracts handed out and desperate moves made by a regime fighting to save their jobs, only to lose them 1 year later anyway. Jason Garrett seemed to have 9 lives with the Cowboys. He hung around for 10 years as their head coach, that despite only winning 2 playoff games in his tenure and never making it past the divisional round. Sometimes, I wonder how much better those Dak and Zeke teams would have been with a different coach running things. And for as great as Mike Tomlin was, he closed out his tenure with the Steelers with 9 straight years without a playoff win. 9 straight years without a playoff win. I can't help but think that sticking around with Tomlin for that long really put the Steelers behind the 8 ball and prevented them from doing a full-on rebuild. And those last few seasons with Tomlin got really, really stale. Hey, maybe, just maybe, this isn't so insane after all. Maybe firing Sean McDermott, Mike Tomlin, and John Harbaugh for all their success isn't the most insane thing in the world. Maybe it's not insane to have Matt LaFleur, Kevin O'Connell, and Dan Campbell on the hot seat. Because the real insanity is trying the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I'll say it again. When in doubt, fire the coach. When you've realized that your shot has come and gone, you have to make the tough decision and pull the plug as soon as possible. And oftentimes, your only shot comes and goes sooner than you may realize. I think there's a lot of data that backs this up, right? I've given you some stats. I've even shown a few concrete examples. This isn't just a hypothesis. There is plenty of instances of having a short lease with your head coach working in the NFL. But that still begs the question, why? Why does this work? How are teams knowing when it's the right time to move on and not just guessing and getting lucky? Well, that requires you to accept one of the harshest realities in all of sports. All right. Admittedly, I don't have a quote to kick off this chapter, but I do have an anecdote. This is something that every sports fan can relate to, a canon event. In mid-December of 2016, the Minnesota Vikings were fighting for their playoff lives, but had a golden opportunity to get themselves back into the postseason, hosting a pretty mid-Colts team for their Week 15 matchup. And better yet, star running back and my childhood hero, Adrian Peterson, was set to make his triumphant return, playing in his first game since week 2 of that season. This was the boost that the Vikings needed, the reigning rushing champ returning to the lineup. He was going to go for 200 yards and carry the Vikings like it was 2012 all over again. But that's not quite what happened. Peterson looked like a shell of himself. He carried the ball only 6 times for 22 yards. The Vikings got smoked by the Colts, fell out of the playoff race, and Adrian Peterson never played for the Vikings ever again. That was the moment that I knew my goat was washed. Heck, we all saw it, everyone knew, and because of that, there was no uproar when the Vikings decided to move on from Peterson the following season. There was no clamoring to be patient with him. We all saw it with our own eyes. We knew we had to start over. When it comes to players, it's pretty easy to tell when they're washed or when it's time to move on, right? You can factor in things like age, injury, production, or even just a good old-fashioned eye test. But what about with coaches? It's not quite that simple, right? But I do think that coaches can and do get washed, and I've spent all of this video stressing that it's important to know when the right time to move on is. But how do you know when that time is? Let's revisit the Eagles. How did they know it was the right time to move on from Doug Peterson? You gotta hand it to him, right? They quickly turned things around after letting Peterson go, and he just wasn't the same guy in his next stop with the Jaguars. Now he's not even in the league, and he got practically zero interest during this past coaching cycle. He's washed. But how did Philly know? He was 52 years old when he got fired, a pretty normal age for a coach, and if anything, he was seen as a young up-and-comer during his time with the Eagles. But the biggest advantage that he brought to the table declined over time. Peterson was an offensive-minded guy, and his big idea was RPOs, run-pass options. In 2017, the year the Eagles won the Super Bowl, Peterson dialed up 207 RPOs, way above the league average of 66. At the time, this was a concept that was used way more at the college level than the pros, and the NFL just really wasn't prepared for it. Shoot, go listen to the Vikings players mic'd up when they faced Philly in the NFC Championship game. They were just not ready for what hit them. But things changed. The league catches up. More and more teams started using RPOs at a high volume. Defenses adjusted, and Peterson's offense was no longer all that special. He got washed, and I'd say it's really not all that different from injury and age taking away Adrian Peterson's explosiveness. Hey, you could tell a pretty similar story about the previous Eagles coach, Chip Kelly. His blur, hurry-up offense was revolutionary for about a year, and then defenses caught up and Kelly was washed. Mike McDaniel spamming cheat motions and outside zone through the league for a loop until Brandon Staley cracked the code and just jammed the receivers at the line of scrimmage and out-physicaled Miami. Mike McDaniel, or at least the one that we knew in Miami, got washed. And you know, another coach that I've had some fun debates with my chat was, ironically enough, Andy Reid. There's no denying he's an all-time great, but if you ask me, I think he's kind of washed. In a perfect world, the Chiefs would have moved on from Reid this year and gotten a fresh start. I think he's lost a step as an offensive mind. The Chiefs scheme has gotten a little stale, and Reid has had maybe just a little bit too much faith in his circle, holding on to Matt Nagy for way too long, and when finally deciding to make a change at OC, just decides to bring back Eric Bieniemy. Reid and Bieniemy were an awesome duo in 2020, but they just don't move me the same way in 2026. As a coach, that's how you lose a step. That's how you get washed, when your big idea is no longer a big idea. And that's just talking schematically, right? As I've said in a previous video, there's more ways for a coach to contribute than just scheming things up, but unfortunately, that also means that there's more ways for a coach to get washed than just their scheme getting outdated. Bill Belichick's final few years with the Patriots were rough, but hey, to his credit, he never really lost his touch as a defensive mind. Even at the end, his defenses were super productive and punched way above their weight. That's not what did him in. It was Bill, the leader, the CEO, that was washed. Blind loyalty to his guys, doing stuff like putting Matt Patricia and Joe Judge in charge of the offense, and a string of truly horrible drafts that he orchestrated. That's what did him in. The Patriot way was awesome back in 2003, but not so much in 2023. Mike Zimmer's whole shtick of being an angry grump who hated offense was a lot easier to stomach back when his defenses would bash in skulls on a weekly basis, but it just didn't hit the same as the roster and the league evolved. By the 2020s, most of Minnesota's top players were on offense, and Zimmer's hard-nosed, old-fashioned management style just wasn't the norm in the NFL anymore. And as the rest of the NFL began to embrace analytics and game management decisions and got a better understanding of when to go for it on fourth down, when to go for two, or when to use your timeouts, Mike Tomlin just kind of stood pat, and in doing that, he fell behind. Not being tapped in with this stuff might have been fine in 2008, but in the 2020s, that puts you at a huge disadvantage. If Andy Reid, Bill Belichick, and Mike Tomlin can fall off, anyone can fall off, in the same way that if Adrian Peterson can fall off, anyone can fall off. I think this is really important to acknowledge. A coach being washed up usually isn't talked about as much as a player being washed up, but maybe it should be. You know, moving on from a coach is a tough call to make, but maybe having this understanding makes it a little bit easier of a pill to swallow. And yeah, you know what? There's a chance that the next coach you bring in isn't quite as good as the previous guy, but I don't think that should paralyze you from moving and striving for more. The Vikings let Adrian Peterson go, and no, none of the running backs they've trotted out since have been as good as him, but that doesn't mean it wasn't the right move to make. Peak for peak, Andy Reid is a better coach than Doug Peterson and Nick Sirianni, but the Eagles would have never won their only Super Bowls in franchise history had they not moved on from Reid. And to go full circle, if the Chiefs did end up firing Andy Reid, yeah, there's a chance the next coach isn't quite as good as Reid was, but I don't think that means they should just stand pat. I think this fear of moving on has held a lot of teams back, and I'm going to say to that, when in doubt, fire the coach. This is not just some radical pie-in-the-sky idea. It works. It has worked, and I think it will continue to work. This is something that I'm going to keep advocating for, and I unequivocally stand with the Steelers, Ravens, and Bills for the decisions that they made this year, and the other 7 teams that made their decisions as well. But what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments below. Do you think that teams are too patient with their head coaches, not patient enough, just right? How are you feeling about your head coach right now? I'm curious. Let me hear it in the comments. As always, I appreciate you guys so much watching. Whether you guys have been around for years or this is your first video, thank you so much. And if you are new, feel free to check out what else I've got going on. I've got a ton of other videos just like this one, and I also live stream most weeks and have a lot of fun doing that. And I'm on TikTok, Twitter. Feel free to check the link tree in my description to follow me all across all my socials. But anyways, that's all I've got for today. Again, appreciate you guys, and until next time, the doctor is out.